Mr. Appleby was a small, prim man, who wore rimless spectacles, parted his greying hair in the middle, and took sober pleasure in pointing out that there was no room in the properly organised life for the operations of chance. Consequently, when he decided that the time had come to investigate the most efficient methods for disposing of his wife, he knew where to look. He found the book, a text on forensic medicine, on the shelf of a second-hand bookshop among several volumes of a like topic, and since all but one were in a distressingly shabby and dog-eared state which offended him to the very core, he chose the only one in reasonably good condition. Most of the cases it presented, he discovered on closer examination, were horrid studies of the results, vividly illustrated, of madness and lust, enough to set any decent man wondering at the number of monsters inhabiting the earth. One case, however, seemed to be exactly what he was looking for, and this he made the subject of his most intensive study. It was the case of Mrs. X. The book was replete with Mrs. X's and Mr. Y's and Miss Z's, who died after what was presumably an accidental fall on a scatter-rug in her home. However, a lawyer representing the interests of the late lamented charged her husband with murder, and a coroner's investigation was attempting to prove his charge when the accused abruptly settled matters by dropping dead of a heart attack. All this was of moderate interest to Mr. Appleby, whose motive, a desire to come into the immediate possession of his wife's estate, was strikingly similar to the alleged motive of Mrs. X's husband. But more important were the actual details of the case. Mrs. X had been in the act of bringing him a glass of water when the scatter-rug, as scatter-rugs will, had suddenly slipped from under her feet. In rebuttal, the indefatigable lawyer had produced a medical authority who made clear through a number of charts, all of which were handsomely reproduced in the book, that in the act of receiving the glass of water it would have been child's play for the husband to lay one hand behind his wife's shoulder, another hand along her jaw, and with a sudden thrust produce the same drastic results as the fall on the scatter-rug, without leaving any clues as to the nature of his crime. It should be made clear now that in studying these charts and explanations relentlessly, Mr. Appleby was not acting the part of the greedy man going to any lengths to appease that greed. True, it was money he wanted, but it was money for the maintenance of what he regarded as a holy cause. And that was his shop, Appleby, Antiques and Curios. The shop was the sun of Mr. Appleby's universe. He had bought it 20 years before, with the pittance left by his father, and at best it provided him with a poor living. At worst, and it was usually at worst, it had forced him to draw on his mother's meagre store of goodwill and capital. Since his mother was not one to give up a penny lightly, the shop brought about a series of pitched battles which, however, always saw it the victor, since, in the last analysis, the shop was to Mr. Appleby what Mr. Appleby was to his mother. The unhappy triangle was finally shattered by his mother's death, at which time Mr. Appleby discovered that she had played a far greater role in maintaining his orderly little world than he had hitherto realized. This concerned not only the money she occasionally gave him, but also his personal habits. He ate lightly and warily. His mother had been adept at roasting and boiling his meals to perfection. His nerves were violently shaken if anything in the house was out of place, and she had been a living assurance he would be spared this. Her death, therefore, left a vast and uncomfortable gap in his life, and in studying methods to fill it, he was led to contemplate marriage, and then to the act itself. His wife was a pale, thin-lipped woman, so much like his mother in appearance and gesture that sometimes on her entrance into a room he was taken aback at the resemblance. In only one respect did she fail him. She could not understand the significance of the shop, nor his feelings about it. That was disclosed the first time he broached the subject of a small loan that would enable him to meet some business expenses. Mrs. Appleby had been well in the process of withering on the vine when her husband-to-be had proposed to her, but to give her her full due, she was not won by the mere prospect of finally making a marriage. Actually, though, she would have blushed at such a blunt statement of her secret thought. It was the large, mournful eyes beneath his rimless spectacles that turned the trick, promising as they did hidden depths of emotion, neatly garbed in utter respectability. When she learned very soon after her wedding that the hidden depths were evidently too well hidden ever to be explored by her, she shrugged the matter off and turned to boiling and toasting his meals with good enough grace. The knowledge that the impressive Appleby Antiques and Curios was a hollow shell she took in a different spirit. She made some brisk investigations, and then announced her findings to Mr. Appleby with some heat. "Antiques and curios? Why, the whole collection of stuff is nothing but a pile of junk. It's just a bunch of worthless dust-catchers, that's all it is." What she did not understand was that these objects, which to the crass and commercial eye might seem worthless, were to Mr. Appleby the stuff of life itself. The shop had grown directly from his childhood mania for collecting, for assorting and labelling and preserving anything he could lay his hands on, and the value of any item in the shop increased proportionately with the length of time he possessed it. Whether a cracked imitation of Sèvres, or clumsily faked Chippendale, or rusty sabre, made no difference. Each piece had won a place for itself, a permanent, immutable place as far as Mr. Appleby was concerned. And strangely enough, it was the sincere agony he suffered in giving up a piece that led to the few sales he made. The customer who was uncertain of values had only to get a glimpse of his agony to be convinced that they were getting a rare bargain. Fortunately, no customer could have imagined for a moment, but it was the thought of the empty space left by the object's departure, the brief disorder which the emptiness made, and not a passion for the object itself, that drew Mr. Appleby's pinched features into a mask of pain. So, not understanding, Mrs. Appleby took an unsympathetic tack. "You'll get my mite when I'm dead and gone, and only when I'm dead and gone." Thus unwittingly she tried herself, was found wanting, and it only remained the sentence to be executed. When the time came, Mr. Appleby applied the lessons he had gleaned from his invaluable textbook, and found them accurate in every detail. It was over quickly, quietly, and, outside of a splash of water on his trousers, neatly. The medical examiner growled something about those indescribable scatterrugs costing more lives than drunken motorists. The policeman in charge kindly offered to do whatever he could in the way of making funeral arrangements, and that was all there was to it. It had been so easy, so undramatic. In fact, it was not until a week later, when a properly sympathetic lawyer was making him an account of his wife's estate, that Mr. Appleby suddenly understood the whole magnificent new world that had opened up to him. Discretion must sometimes outweigh sentiment, and Mr. Appleby was, if anything, a discreet man. After his wife's estate had been cleared, the shop was moved to another location, far from its original setting. It was moved again after the sudden demise of the second Mrs. Appleby, and by the time the sixth Mrs. Appleby had been disposed of, the removals were merely part of a fruitful pattern. Because of their similarities, they were all pale, thin-featured women with pinched lips, adept at toasting and boiling, and adamant on the subjects of regularity and order. Mr. Appleby was inclined to remember the departed wives rather vaguely, en masse. Only in one regard did he qualify them: the number of digits their bank accounts totalled up to. For that reason he thought of the first two Mrs. Applebys as 4s, the third as a 3, an unpleasant surprise, and the last 3 as 5s. The sum would have been a pretty penny by anyone else's standards, but since each succeeding portion of it had been snapped up by the insatiable Appleby Antiques and Curios in much the same way a fly is snapped up by a hungry lizard, Mr. Appleby found himself soon after the burial of the sixth Mrs. Appleby in deeper and warmer financial waters than ever. So desperate were the circumstances that although he dreamed of another 5, he would have settled for a 4 on the spot. It was at this opportune moment that Martha Sturgis entered his life, and after 15 minutes' conversation with her he brushed all thoughts of 4s and 5s from his mind. Martha Sturgis, it seemed, was a 6. It was not only in the extent of her fortune that she broke the pattern established by the women of Mr. Appleby's previous experience. Unlike them, Martha Sturgis was a large, rather shapeless woman, who in person, dress, and manner might almost be called— Mr. Appleby shuddered a little at the word— blousy. It was remotely possible that, properly veneered, harnessed, coiffured, and apparelled, she might have been made into something presentable. But from all indications Martha Sturgis was a woman who went out of her way to defy such conventions. Her hair, dyed a shocking orange red, was piled carelessly on her head. Her blobby features were recklessly powdered and painted entirely to their disadvantage. Her clothes, obviously worn for comfort, were at the same time painfully garish, and her shoes gave evidence of long and pleasurable wear, without corresponding care being given to their upkeep. Of all this and its effect on the beholder, Martha Sturgis seemed totally unaware. She strode through Appleby antiques and curios with an energy that set movable objects dancing in their places. She smoked incessantly, lighting one cigarette from another, while Mr. Appleby fanned the air before his face and coughed suggestively, and she talked without pause, loudly, in a deep, hoarse voice that dinned strangely in a shop so accustomed to the higher, thinner note. In the first 14 minutes of her acquaintance, the one quality she displayed that led Mr. Appleby to modify some of his immediate revulsion, even a trifle, was the care with which she priced each article. She examined, evaluated, and cross-examined in detail before moving on with obvious disapproval, and he moved along with her, with mounting assurance that he could get her out of the shop before any damage was done to the stock or his patients. And then, in the 15th minute, she spoke the word. "I've got £500,000 in the bank, but I never thought I'd get around to spending a penny of it on this kind of stuff." Mr. Appleby had his hand before his face, preparatory to waving aside some of the tobacco smoke that eddied about him. In the time it took the hand to drop nervelessly to his side, his mind attacked an astonishing number of problems. One concerned the important finger on her left hand, which was ringless. The other concerned certain mathematical problems largely dealing with short-term notes, long-term notes, and rates of interest. By the time the hand touched his side, the problems, as far as Mr. Appleby was concerned, were well on the way to solution. And it may be noted there was an added fillip given the matter by the very nature of Martha Sturgis's slovenly and strident being. Looking at her after she had spoken the word, another man might perhaps have seen her through the sort of veil that a wise photographer casts over the lens of his camera in taking the picture of a prosperous but unprepossessing subject. Mr. Appleby, incapable of such self-deceit, girded himself instead with the example of the man who carried a heavy weight on his back for the pleasure it gave him in laying it down. Not only would the final act of a marriage to Martha Sturgis solve important mathematical problems, but it was an act he could play out with the gusto of a man ridding the world of an unpleasant object. Therefore he turned his eyes, more melancholy and luminous than ever, on her, and said, "It's a great pity, Mrs." She told him her name, emphasizing the Miss before it, and Mr. Appleby smiled apologetically. "Of course. As I was saying, it's a great pity when someone of refinement and culture should never have known the joy of possession of fine works of art. But as we all learn, it is never too late to begin, is it?" "Too late, my dear man! If it is your idea that I'm here to start cluttering up my life with your monstrosities, perish the thought. What I'm here for is to buy a gift for a friend, a thoroughly infuriating and loathsome person who happens to have the nature and disposition of a bar of stainless steel. I can't think of a better way of showing my feelings towards her than by presenting her with almost anything displayed in your shop. If possible, I should also like delivery arranged, so I can be on the scene when she receives the package." Mr. Appleby staggered under this, then rallied valiantly. "In that case, it is out of the question. Completely out of the question." "Nonsense!
I'll arrange for delivery myself if you can't handle it. Really, you ought to understand there's no point in doing this sort of thing unless you're able to watch the results."
"I am not alluding to the matter of delivery. What I am trying to make clear is that I cannot possibly permit anything in my shop to be bought in such a spirit. Not for any price you could name."
What was that you said?
It was a perilous moment, and Mr. Appleby knew it. His next words could set her off into another spasm of that awful laugh that would devastate him completely, or worse, could send her right out of the shop forever, or could decide the issue in his favour then and there. But it was a moment that had to be met, and, thought Mr. Appleby desperately, whatever else Martha Sturgis might be, she was a woman. It is the policy of this shop never to sell anything unless the prospective purchaser shows full appreciation of the article to be bought, and can assure it the care and devotion to which it is entitled. That has always been the policy, and always will be as long as I am here. Anything other than that I would regard as desecration." He watched Martha Sturgis with bated breath. There was a chair near-by, and she dropped into it heavily, so that her skirts were drawn tight by her widespread thighs, and the obscene shoes were displayed mercilessly. She lit another cigarette, regarding him meanwhile with narrowed eyes through the flame of a match. Then she fanned the air a little to dispel the cloud of smoke that rose towards him.
"You know, that's very interesting. I'd like to hear more about it."
To the inexperienced, the problems of drawing information of the most powerful nature from a total stranger would seem a perplexing one. To Mr. Appleby, whose interests had so often been dependent on such information, it was no problem at all. In a very short time he had evidence that Martha Sturgis's estimate of her fortune was quite accurate, that she was apparently alone in the world, without relatives or intimate friends, and that she was not averse to the idea of marriage. This last he drew from her during her now regular visits to the shop, where she would spread herself comfortably on a chair and talk to him endlessly. Much of her talk was about her father, to whom Mr. Appleby evidently bore a striking resemblance.
"He even dressed like you. Neat as a pin. And not only about himself, either. He used to make an inspection of the house every day, march through it and make sure everything was exactly where it had to be. And he kept it up right to the end. I remember an hour before he died how he went about straightening pictures on the wall."
Mr. Appleby, who had been peering with some irritation at a picture that hung slightly awry on the shop wall, turned his attention reluctantly from it. "And you were with him to the end?"
"Oh, indeed I was."
"Well, one does deserve some reward for such sacrifice, doesn't one? Especially— oh, I hope this will not embarrass you, Miss Sturgis, but especially when one considers that such a woman as yourself could undoubtedly have left the care of an aged father to enter matrimony almost at will.
Is that not so? Well, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. I won't deny I've had my dreams. That's all they are, though. I suppose that's all they'll ever be."
"Why?"
"Because I've never yet met the man who could fit those dreams. I'm not a simpering schoolgirl, Mr. Appleby. I don't have to balance myself against my bank account to know why any man would devote himself to me, and frankly his motives would be of no interest. But he must be a decent, respectable man, who would spend every moment of his life worrying about me and caring for me, and he must be a man who would make the memory of my father a living thing."
"Miss Sturgis, you may yet meet such a man."
"Do you mean that, Mr. Appleby? Do you really believe that?"
"He may be closer than you dare realize." Experience had proved to Mr. Appleby that once the ice is broken, the best thing to do is take a deep breath and plunge in. Accordingly, he let very few days elapse before he made his proposal. "Miss Sturgis, there comes a time to every lonely man when he can no longer bear his loneliness. If at such a time he is fortunate enough to meet the one woman to whom he could give unreservedly all his respect and tender feelings, he is a fortunate man indeed. Miss Sturgis,
I am that man." "Why, Mr. Appleby, that's really very good of you. But—" At this note of indecision his heart sank. "Wait. If you have any doubts, Miss Sturgis, please speak them now, so that I may answer them. Considering the state of my emotions, that would only be fair, wouldn't it?" "Well, I suppose so. You see, Mr. Appleby, I'd rather not get married at all than take the chance of getting someone who wasn't prepared to be exactly what I'm looking for in a marriage. Absolute single-minded devotion all the days of my life. Miss Sturgis, I am prepared to give you no less." "Men say these things so easily. But I shall certainly think about it, Mr. Appleby." The dismal prospect of waiting an indefinite time for a woman of such careless habits to render a decision was not made any lighter by the sudden receipt a few days later of a note peremptorily requesting Mr. Appleby's presence at the offices of Gainsborough and Golding, attorneys at law. With his creditors closing in like a wolf-pack, Mr. Appleby could only surmise the worst. And he was pleasantly surprised upon his arrival at Gainsborough and Golding to find that they represented not his creditors, but Martha Sturgis herself. The elder Gainsborough, obviously very much the guiding spirit of the firm, was a short, immensely fat man, with pendulous dewlaps that almost concealed his collar, and large fishy eyes that goggled at Mr. Appleby. The younger Gainsborough was a duplicate of his brother, with jowls not quite so impressive, while Golding was an impassive young man with a hatchet face.
"This is a delicate matter. Miss Sturgis is an esteemed client. Has mentioned entering matrimony with you, sir."
Mr. Appleby, sitting primly on his chair, was stirred by a pleased excitement.
"Yes, and while Miss Sturgis is perfectly willing to concede that her fortune may be the subject of attraction in a man's eyes, she is also willing to dismiss that issue, to ignore it, set it aside, if the suitor is prepared to meet all other expectations in marriage."
"I am."
"Mr. Appleby, have you been married before?"
Mr. Appleby thought swiftly. Denial would make any chance word about his past a deadly trap. Admission, on the other hand, was a safeguard against that, and a thoroughly respectable one.
Yes.
"Divorced? Oh, good heavens, no."
Good, very good. Perhaps, Mr. Appleby, the question seemed impertinent in these days of moral laxity.
"I should like it known in any case that I am as far from moral laxity as any human being can be. Tobacco, strong drink, and loose women, yes, are all unknown to me."
Under any conditions, Miss Sturgis would not make any precipitate decision. She should have her answer for you within a month. However, and during that time, if you don't mind taking the advice of an old man, I suggest that you court her assiduously. She is a woman, Mr. Appleby, and I imagine all women are much alike."
"I imagine they are. Devotion, constancy, that's the ticket." What he was being asked to do, Mr. Appleby reflected in one of his solitary moments, was to put aside the shop and the orderly world it represented, and to set the unappealing figure of Martha Sturgis in its place. It was a temporary measure, of course. It was one that would prove richly rewarding when Martha Sturgis had been properly wed and sent the way of a preceding Mrs. Appleby's, but it was not made any easier by enforced familiarity with a woman. It was inevitable that as Mr. Appleby viewed matters not only as a prospective bridegroom, but also as a prospective widower, so to speak, he found his teeth constantly set on edge by the unwitting irony which crept into so many of her tedious discussions on marriage. "The way I see it is that a man who would divorce his wife would divorce any other woman he ever married. You take a look at all those broken marriages today, and I bet in practically every case you'll find a man who's always shopping around and never finding what he wants. Now, the man I marry must be willing to settle down and stay settled." "Of course. I have heard that a satisfactory marriage increases a woman's span of years. That's an excellent argument for marriage, don't you think?"
Of course. It seemed to him, during the month's trial, most of his conversation was restricted to the single phrase, "of course," delivered with varying inflections. But the tactic must have been the proper one, since at the end of a month he was able to change the formula to "I do," in a wedding ceremony at which Gainsborough, and Golding were the sole guests. Immediately afterwards Mr. Appleby, to his discomfort, was borne off with his bride to a photographer's shop, where innumerable pictures were made under the supervision of the dour Golding, following which Mr. Appleby, to his delight, exchanged documents with his wife which made them each other's heirs to all properties, possessions, etc., whatsoever. If Mr. Appleby had occasionally appeared rather abstracted during these festivities, it was only because his mind was neatly arranging the programme of impending events. The rug, the very same one that had served him so well in 6 previous episodes, had to be placed, and then there would come the moment when he would ask for a glass of water, when he would place that hand on her shoulder, and then the other. It could not be a moment that took place without due time passing, yet it could not be forestalled too long, in view of the pressure exercised by the shop's voracious creditors. Watching the pen in his wife's hand as she signed her will, he decided there would be time within a few weeks. With the will in his possession, there would be no point in waiting longer than that. Before the first of those weeks was up, however, Mr. Appleby knew that even this estimate would have to undergo drastic revision. There was no question about it. He was simply not equipped to cope with his marriage. For one thing, her home, and now his, a brownstone cavern inherited from her mother, was a nightmare of disorder. On the principle, perhaps, that anything flung casually aside was not worth picking up, since it would only be flung aside again, an amazing litter had accumulated in every room. The contents of brimming closets and drawers were recklessly exchanged, mislaid, or added to the general litter, and over all lay a thin film of dust. On Mr. Appleby's quivering nervous system all this had the effect of a finger-nail dragging along an endless blackboard. The one task to which Mrs. Appleby devoted herself, as it happened, was the one which her husband prayerfully wished she would spare herself. She doted on cookery, and during meal-times would trudge back and forth endlessly between kitchen and dining-room, laden with dishes outside any of Mr. Appleby's experience. At his first feeble protests, his wife had taken pains to explain in precise terms that she was sensitive to any criticism of her cooking, even the implied criticism of a partly emptied plate, and therefore Mr. Appleby, plunging hopelessly through rare meats, rich sauces, and heavy pastries, found added to his tribulations the incessant pangs of dyspepsia. Nor were his pains eased by his wife's insistence that he prove himself a trencherman of her mettle. She would thrust plates heaped high with indigestibles under his quivering nose, and, bracing himself like a martyr facing the lions, Mr. Appleby would empty his portion into a digestive tract that cried for simple fare, properly boiled or toasted. It became one of his fondest waking dreams, that scene where he turned from his wife's burial to dine on hot tea and toast, and perhaps a medium-boiled egg. But even that dream and its sequel, where he proceeded to set the house in order, were not sufficient to buoy him up each day when he awoke and reflected on what lay ahead of him. Each day found his wife more insistent in her demands for his attentions, and on that day when she openly reproved him for devoting more of his attentions to the shop than to her, Mr. Appleby knew the time had come to prepare for the final act. He brought home the rug that evening, and carefully laid it in its place between the living-room and the hallway that led to the kitchen. Martha Appleby watched him without any great enthusiasm.
"That's a shabby-looking thing. What is it, Appy? An antique or something?"
She had taken to calling him by that atrocious name, and seemed cheerfully oblivious to the way he winced under it.
He winced now. "It is not an antique, but I do hold it dear for many reasons. It has a great deal of sentimental value for me." "And you brought it for me, didn't you?" "Yes, I did." "Oh, you are a dear, you really are." Watching her cross the rug on slipshod feet to use the telephone, which stood on a small table at the other side of the hallway, Mr. Appleby toyed with the idea that since she used the telephone at about the same time every evening, he could schedule the accident for that time. The advantages were obvious. Since these calls seemed to be the only routine she observed with any fidelity, she would cross the rug at a certain time, and he would be in a position to settle matters then and there. However, thought Mr. Appleby as he polished his spectacles, that brought up the problem of how best to approach her under such circumstances. Clearly the tried-and-tested methods were best, but if the telephone call and the glass of water could be synchronized— "A penny for your thoughts, Appy?" She laid down the telephone and crossed the hallway so that she stood squarely on the rug. Mr. Appleby replaced his spectacles and peered at her through them. "I wish you would not address me by that horrid name. You know I detest it." "Nonsense! I think it's cute." "I do not." "Well, I like it. Anyhow, that couldn't have been what you were thinking about before I started talking to you, could it?" It struck Mr. Appleby that when this stout, unkempt woman pouted, she resembled nothing so much as a wax doll badly worn by time and handling. He pushed away the thought to frame some suitable answer. "As it happens, my mind was on the disgraceful state of my clothes. Need I remind you again that there are buttons missing from practically every garment I own?" "Oh, well, I'll get to it sooner or later. Tomorrow, perhaps?" "I doubt it. Oh, come to sleep, Appy. I'm dead tired." Mr. Appleby followed her thoughtfully. Tomorrow, he knew, he would have to get one of his suits to the tailor if he wanted to have anything fit to wear at the funeral. He had brought home the suit and hung it neatly away. He had eaten his dinner, and he had sat in the living-room listening to his wife's hoarse voice go on for what seemed interminable hours, although the clock was not yet at 9. Now, with rising excitement, he saw her lift herself slowly from her chair and cross the room to the hallway. As she reached for the telephone, Mr. Appleby cleared his throat sharply. "If you don't mind, I'd like a glass of water." Mrs. Appleby turned to look at him. "A glass of water?" "If you don't mind." He waited as she hesitated, then set down the telephone and turned towards the kitchen. There was the sound of a glass being rinsed in the kitchen, and then Mrs. Appleby came to him holding it out. He laid one hand appreciatively on her plump shoulder, and then lifted the other as if to brush back a strand of untidy hair at her cheek. "Is that what happened to all the others?" Mr. Appleby felt his hand freeze in mid-air, and the chill from it run down into his marrow. "Others? What others?" She smiled grimly at him, and he saw that the glass of water in her hand was perfectly steady. 6 others. Oh, that is 6 by my count. Why, were there more? No, I mean, I don't understand what you're talking about." "Oh, dear Appy, surely you couldn't forget 6 wives just like that? Unless, of course, I've come to mean so much to you you can't bear to think of the others. That would be lovely, wouldn't it?" "I was married before. I made it quite clear. This talk of 6 wives, though—" "Of course you were married before, Appy. And it was quite easy to find out to whom. And it was just as easy to find out about the one before that, and all the others. Or even about your mother, or where you went to school, or where you were born. You see, Appy, Mr. Gainsborough is really a very clever man." "It was Gainsborough who put you up to this?" "Not at all, you foolish little man. All the time you were making your plans, I was unmaking them. From the moment I laid eyes on you, I knew you for what you are. Does that surprise you?" Mr. Appleby
struggled with the emotions of a man who has picked up a twig to find that it is a viper in his hand. "How could you know?" "Because you are the image of my father. Because in everything, the way you dress, your insufferable neatness, your priggish arrogance, the little moral lectures you dote on, you are what he was. And all my life I hated him for what he was, and what he did to my mother. He married her for her money, made every day of her life a nightmare, and then he killed her for what was left of her fortune." "Killed her?" "Oh, come. Do you think you're the only man who was ever capable of that? Yes, he killed her. Murdered her, if you prefer, by asking for a glass of water and then breaking her neck when she offered it to him. A method strangely similar to yours, isn't it?" What happened to him? Tell me what happened. Was he caught?" "No, he was never caught. There were no witnesses to what he did. But Mr. Gainsborough had been my mother's lawyer and dear friend. He had suspicions, and he demanded a hearing. He brought a doctor to the hearing, who made it plain how my father could have killed her, and made it look as though she'd slipped on a rug. But before there was any decision, my father died of a heart attack." "That was the case I read." "When he was gone, I swore I would some day find a man exactly like him, and I would make that man live the life my father should have lived. I would know his every habit and every taste, and none of them should go satisfied. I would know he married me for my money, and he would never get a penny of it until I was dead and gone. And that would be a long, long time, because he would spend his life taking care I would live out my life to the last possible breath." "Oh, no. You can't make him do that." He moved an inch closer. "It does sound strange, doesn't it, Appy? But hardly as strange as the fact that your 6 wives died by slipping on a rug, very much like this one, while bringing you a glass of water very much like this one. So strange that Mr. Gainsborough was led to remark that too many coincidences will certainly hang a man, especially if there's reason to bring them to light in a trial for murder." Mr. Appleby suddenly found the constriction of his collar unbearable. "That doesn't answer my question. How can you make sure that I would devote my life to prolonging yours?" "A man whose wife is in a position to have him hanged should be able to see that clearly." "No, I only see that such a man is forced to rid himself of that wife as quickly as possible." "Oh, well, that's where the arrangements come in." "Arrangements? What arrangements?" "I'd very much like to explain them. In fact, I see the time has come when it's imperative to do so. But I do find it a bit uncomfortable standing here like this." "Never mind that." "Well, then, Mr. Gainsborough now has all the documents about your marriages, the way the previous deaths took place, the way you always happened to get the bequests at just the right moment to pay your shop's debts. Besides this, he has a letter from me, explaining that in the event of my death an investigation be made immediately and all necessary action be taken. Mr. Gainsborough's very efficient. The fingerprints and photographs—" "Fingerprints and photographs?" "Of course. After my father's death it was found that he had made all preparations for a quick trip abroad. Mr. Gainsborough has assured me that in case you have any such ideas in your mind, you should get rid of them, because no matter where you are, he said, it will be quite easy to bring you back again." "What do you want of me? Surely you don't expect me to stay now?" "Oh, yes, I do. And since we've come to this point, I may as well tell you I expect you to give up your useless shop once and for all, and make it a point to be at home with me the entire day." "Give up the shop?" "Well, you must remember, Appy, that in my letter asking for a full investigation of my death, I didn't specify death by any particular means. I look forward to a long and pleasant life with you always at my side, and perhaps, mind you, I look forward to a long and pleasant life with you always at my side,
And perhaps, and I say only perhaps, some day I shall turn over the letter and all the evidence to you. You can see how much it is in your interest, therefore, to watch over me very carefully." The telephone rang with abrupt violence, and Mrs. Appleby nodded towards it, almost as carefully as Mr. Gainsborough. "You see, unless I call him every evening at 9 to report I'm well and happy, it seems he'll jump to the most shocking conclusions." "Wait." He lifted the telephone. There was no mistaking the voice that spoke.
Hello, Mrs. Appleby?"
Mr. Appleby essayed a cunning move. "No, I'm afraid she can't speak to you now. What is it?" The voice in his ear took an unmistakably cold menace.
"This is Gainsborough, Mr. Appleby, and I wish to speak to your wife immediately. I will give you 10 seconds to have her come to this phone, Mr. Appleby. Do you understand?"
Mr. Appleby turned dully towards his wife and held out the telephone. "It's for you," he said, and then saw with a start of terror that as she turned to set down the glass of water, the rug skidded slightly under her feet. Her arms flailed the air as she fought for balance. The glass smashed at his feet, drenching his neat trousers, and her face twisted into a silent scream. Then her body struck the floor and lay inertly in the position with which he was so familiar. Watching her, he was barely conscious of the voice emerging tinnily from the telephone in his hand.
"Your 10 seconds are up, Mr. Appleby. Do you understand? Your time is up."